Welcome back to Beer Brackets, everybody. Today is an amazing review that we've got for you. We are tackling a major beer brand that may or may not have a special place in Alessandro's heart that we'll get to very shortly. As you can see here in the beer on my table, we are going to be doing a full review of Denmark's Carlsberg. Along with the full review, we're going to have a can versus bottle. We're also going to have some really interesting Inside the Brackets coming up on Carlsberg, so keep an eye open for that one. We've been talking about doing this one for a long time.
We have.
There's a couple of reasons why this beer is special and why we've been excited about reviewing this beer. Mainly because it links back to your roots. I mean, everybody who's been watching the channel knows about your Italian roots, but you also have some Danish roots.
I do actually. My mom is from Denmark, so I'm half Italian, half Danish. So I've spent quite a few summers and other times of the year in Denmark. So obviously I'm tied also to a lot of the beer culture that exists up there, and Carlsberg is obviously part of that.
What a mix, Italian and Danish. Anybody who's watched our reviews before knows that, give a little bit of a history on the beers that we're talking about. But for this one, because it's so close to your heart, I'm going to throw it over to you, my friend. For anybody who doesn't know about Carlsberg, what would you tell them? What do we need to know before we get into this review?
Well, thank you so much, my friend. Well,
You're
first
very
of all,
welcome. You're very welcome.
It's a pleasure to be talking about this beer here tonight with you and with all our viewers. It's an honor. It's an honor.
It's quite the honor. Quite the honor.
First of all, Carlsberg is it's a Danish beer. It's brewed in outside of Copenhagen, which is the capital in Denmark. It was founded in 1847 by a gentleman named J.C. or Jacob Christian Jacobsen. So Jacob Jacobsen. That's apparently was a thing, like giving the name on close to the last name. Yeah, but
that's
this
cool.
gentleman,
Jacob Jacobsen.
Yeah, it's a cool name, but J.C. Jacobsen, for short.
And the can there.
This gentleman was quite actually interesting because he was born into a family of brewers. When he turned 24, his dad passed. He pretty much got thrown into the opportunity of brewing. But one thing that he did is that he started visiting a lot of the other breweries that at the time in the 1800s were leading. One in particular that he visited was Spaten, that at the time was producing some pretty amazing lagers that were starting to not dominate,
some
but becoming
of
interest in the rest of Europe. And also the production method. And one of the things that he brought home, other than all the knowledge and the experience, was actually some yeast from Spaten. And we'll get into a little bit of that at a later time, but there's a little bit of a legend there on how he brought it back.
It's such a good beer legend too.
So you might wonder, well, his name is Jacobsen, how is the name Carlsberg? Well, that comes into play a little bit later because he starts producing beer in 1847, a couple of years later after he comes back from Spaten. He founds Carlsberg beer in honor of his son. His name was Carl, and in Danish, berg or bjerg, that's how we say it in Danish, is mountain or hill, because in Denmark there's not really any mountains, there's just hills. So Carl's mountain. After the little hill on which the brewery was first founded. So there's a little bit of a background on that.
Thank you so much for that background, man. I could tell this beer is close to your heart. You knew quite a bit about that offhand. Well, we have been beerless for quite some time. I think this is a review after all. Now that we have a good little background on the Carlsberg brewery, we got to crack these beer opens. Let's get right into the review.
Let's do it, my friend.
I love a good Pilsner. I have never had it in the can. I have always had Carlsberg in the bottle. And so traditionally, Carlsberg comes in that clear green bottle, right? And like we've talked about many a times on the channel, that clear glass does have many effects on the beer. So I'm used to Carlsberg having that kind of skunkiness that comes from the clear bottle. So I'm super excited to drink it in a more kind of untouched format. Keep an eye open for the can versus bottle. That is coming. So we will do a really solid comparison on that. Aroma cheers, my friend.
Aroma cheers, my friend.
God, let me know what you think.
So like you mentioned here, for me, it's a little difficult to separate some of the more nostalgic components, but trying to be very, accurate and a
when you were
barometer.
drinking Carlsberg as a child in Denmark?
Oh, possibly.
young Alessandro sipping Carlsbergs between his math lessons.
That's it's in Denmark, like beer is pretty much like water.
It's like water, right? Is it like, I remember one time, last time I was in Dublin, I remember going to like a corner store, a Spar, and the beer was actually cheaper than water. You get a can of beer for cheaper than a bottle of mineral water.
I perfectly understand and relate to that.
Yeah, as it should be. As it should be.
Exactly. What I pick up is predominantly a very nice malt, slightly sweetness. Hops are very gentle, almost like herbal, but kind of like freshly cut grass, like in not quite near, like it's almost a little bit in the distance, using the distance as always.
Beer in the distance.
But overall, I really like how those elements are playing, and for me, really like, and I'll be completely honest here.
Yeah.
But when I smell this, like it takes me right back to all those summers in Denmark where I used to go, so it's really a power of like transportation, like that. The smell has that. So for me, this is a 3 on 3, and there's a little bit of a nostalgic element. So I understand that it's bumped up a little bit, but I like how those elements are playing. Like it's quite unique for me. What do you think, my friend?
I'm not gonna lie, buddy. I'm not gonna sugarcoat this. I think there is a little bit of nostalgia there for you. Is this a 3 on 3 for me? I don't think so. Actually, when I poured it out, the aroma was pretty strong. Now it's kind of faded a little bit. It's really nice Pilsner aroma. I would like a little bit more out of it, though. I'd like to be able to smell the hops a little bit more. I'd like to be able to smell the malt a little bit more.
I can see that.
It's nice. It's making me really want to go in for a sip. I'm thinking, and again, when we're reviewing these beers, you got to compare it to other beers in the same category. So if I'm comparing it to other Pilsners, I think a 2. I think a 2 on 3 is a good start. So let's see where it goes from here, because I'm desperate to taste this. And again, I've never tasted Carlsberg without that skunkiness from the clear bottle. So let's see.
Cheers to you, my friend. Malt is very, very gentle. There is a nice toastiness, roasted character, like in initially, but then that fades away pretty quickly. Hops presence is very little, almost like a slight crispiness at the end with a little bit of bitterness. But I find that element of sweetness is showcasing a little bit. Yeah. And on the aroma, like I feel like it's more like like I said, a nostalgia effect. On the taste, like
with you.
Yeah, a little bit. Like on the taste,
which is understandable. It's totally understandable.
On the taste, I think I will agree with you, and I think a 2 is where I would go. If you're drinking this cold, it's refreshing, but I think what's missing a little bit for me is that hop presence. Like it's a little bit too light on the hops here for me.
Yeah. With my Pilsners, I really do appreciate more of a hop presence. I think the Pilsner Urquell is probably the best example of maybe what would be close to my ideal Pilsner, where it's really, really hop forward in that sense. I love saying that, hop forward. It always makes me laugh a little bit. The hops are really present. It's definitely lacking on this. The taste is really nice. It's really smooth. You get those roasted malts. There's not much else there. It's really smooth. It's really easy drinking. This is the kind of beer where if you chill it, and it'd go down so nice on a hot summer day. Having this on draft, sitting out on a patio, I'm sure this is fantastic. Analyzing it as a one-off beer experience for the taste, there's not too much there. I'm actually going to go with a 1.5. Not because it's bad at all, just because there's not much there for me right now. I'm not getting too much. I would like a little bit more. But now we get to the mouthfeel. My friend, you know what we need to do for the mouthfeel.
Oh, yeah.
We need to do a little bit of a refresher here, as is Beer Bracket's tradition.
I love this tradition.
It's such a good tradition, man. We have many good traditions, but this is probably one of the best.
So many.
I have to say.
The carbonation is there. It's very refreshing at first. I think that the mouthfeel element that comes to mind for me the most right after the initial burst of carbonation is almost that very, I would say, light presence. Like you said, the lack of a lot of hop presence. The malt is there, but not too much. So the elements kind of like have this initial burst, but then they kind of like fade very quickly. I will say, on the mouthfeel, there is one element that we've talked about before that is not always one of my favorite. I call it like slightly oily stickiness.
The oiliness.
That lingers a little bit. I think that's kind of like preventing it for me to get a little bit too high. So I think I'm going to stick with the 1 here on the mouthfeel.
I agree with you. And you know what? This is sort of like unlocking a memory for me. You know how sometimes you hear a song or you see a picture and it unlocks a childhood memory, something nostalgic that you think back to. Thinking about the mouthfeel of this beer is unlocking a past beer memory, an ancient past beer memory, my friend, from a long time ago. I think the last time I had Carlsberg, and I hate because I mentioned Dublin so much on this channel, but it's just one of my most recent trips to Europe. And I remember I was in a pub watching a rugby match, and this particular pub only had Carlsberg. Well, they had a couple of other beers, but Carlsberg was the main thing they had on tap. Had a couple of pints of Carlsberg. And I remember thinking the oiliness on the mouthfeel was something that was a little... It's funny you mentioned that. It's really because that unlocked a memory for me. And I remember associating that oiliness in the mouthfeel with Carlsberg. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's a characteristic of this beer, but it is there. And for me, it prevents that sort of, really wanting to go in and dying to take another sip. It kind of detracts from the refreshing aspect of the beer a little bit. Not so much that it becomes something unenjoyable, but just ticks it down a little bit in terms of the score. I wouldn't go as low as a 1, but I think it's a 1.5. I think is kind of a fair score here. Now, my friend, the finish. I think this beer has a really, really interesting finish. I'm curious to hear what you think. Go for it.
So the finish, as always, is where like all the things kind of come together in a way. In this beer in particular, flavors are kind of like bursting up very initial sip, but then they kind of like fade, and then they leave like this very refreshing, if you take for a moment apart that like sticky oiliness that you might like or not, but like not thinking about that, it really leaves like a very pleasant mix of, I would say, almost like essence of hops and malt.
Essence of beer.
Very, very, very gentle and very subtle.
Yeah.
Where and how, like, it's very difficult to pinpoint, but I think that somehow for me this lands right close to 2, so I can't quite give it a 2, honestly, so I'm gonna stick with 1.5. What do you think, my friend?
I'm kind of a little torn, man, because I know you have a little bit of a sentimental attachment to this beer, and I really wanted to give it really good scores. It's a good beer. And that's what's hard with this. When you're analyzing these individual elements, if you give something a low score, you might think, oh, they don't like it. No, I'm really enjoying this beer. It's really nice. I think there's just not much there on the finish. There's the sweetness from the malts. And even then, it's really kind of not strong up front, but present up front, and then it dissipates and it's gone. But I would really love some hops, man. With my Pilsners, I really love hops on the finish. I want to get a little bit of that bitterness bite. You know what I mean? That just takes that refreshingness of the beer to another level. I think I'm going to have to go with a 1.5. I think that's fair. I was even thinking maybe going as low as a 1, but it's so well brewed. Like, it's such a high quality beer that I really just don't want to go as low as a 1. I don't think that's fair. So now, man, as an overall beer experience with all these intangibles come into play together, what do you think for Carlsberg overall?
I think this was an interesting beer journey because it shows how like some elements can come into play at times, but others, like, they kind of take over. I like how we all both like had that strong feeling about the mouthfeel. But, overall thinking, I think for me, a 2 is where I would land. And I know that part of that 2 is a connection, like obviously, brings in certain memories. But I will agree that that's probably what overall is bringing it a little bit down for me. You can see it in 2 ways, either slightly too sweet, malty sweet, or not bitter enough. Like it's kind of like if it almost had like a little bit more bitterness to kind of cleanse, or if it was slightly less sweet, that would bring it up like quite a bit for me.
Dude, if this beer had a little bit more hop presence, or a little bit of hop presence at all, it would be next level because everything else is so clean. So with just a little bit of hops there, it would be amazing.
I agree.
I think I'm going to go with a 2 as well, even though I gave some lower scores in other categories. I think as an overall beer experience from beginning to end, it's super enjoyable. Like I said, it's really refreshing. It's really clean. Would I order a Carlsberg if I'm in a bar? Sure. Yeah. It's a very nice, refreshing beverage. Is it lacking in some things that I would like to see in a Pilsner? Yeah. But you know what? It's not a 3. It's a 2. All right, so tallying up our final scores for Carlsberg, for me, it came out to a 2.83 on 5, which in our rating system, man, comes out to a good beer. And it is. It was a really good beer. For Alessandro, it's a little bit higher. Came out to 3.16 on 5, 3.16. which is still a good beer in our rating system. So even with that nostalgia, it still came into that good beer category. This was interesting, man. I'm really curious. I'm dying to see our can versus bottle now and how that does, because I feel like I remember the bottled Carlsberg having all these other characteristics that aren't here in the can. So I'm curious. I'm really curious to see how that winds up.
We're going to have to find out. We're going to have to
watch and find out. Cheers, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Let us know down below. What do you think about Carlsberg? Would you agree with our scores? Would you give it a similar on 5 rating? Let us know. We'd love to hear from you. But more important than anything, do not forget to close your Danish beer brackets.
Never forget.
Never forget.